Welcome to Bridging the Education Gap, the podcast where parents, teachers, and education leaders come together to share insights, stories, and strategies that connect learning at home and in school. Whether you're a parent navigating homework struggles, a teacher fostering classroom breakthroughs, or an education leader seeking innovative solutions, this is your space to learn, grow, and collaborate. Each week, we dive into real conversations about education, from tackling pain points to celebrating success stories, all with one goal: to bridge the gap and empower every child's learning journey. I'm your host, Jessica Shelley. Let's get started. Today we have a truly fascinating guest, Dave Younce. Dave's journey through education has taken him from middle school teacher to superintendent and now to consultant, helping schools navigate some of their biggest challenges. We'll dive into his career path, the lessons he's learned from leadership, and what he sees as the future of education. So whether you're an educator, administrator, or just passionate about education, this episode is packed with insights you don't want to miss. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Jessica. I don't know that I've ever been referred to as fascinating, so I'm gonna mark this date as the day that happened. Thank you very much.
There we go, a date in history, which we'll get into here in just a second because that's related to your experience. So walk us through a little bit about your journey in education. What was that like? What made you passionate about going into education and serving students, families, and then ultimately teachers?
Yeah. So thanks again for having me, and thanks for the question. I think maybe what's most relevant for that question is I was not initially passionate about education. I didn't want to be an educator. I grew up the son of a teacher, the grandson of a teacher, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do that just because, maybe I'm built that way. I was convinced that I was going to do something else. So when I left for undergrad, someone had told me that if you're decent at math and science, you could be a good engineer, and I thought I'll be an engineer. And it took a couple semesters and a couple internships for me to realize that I was not a very good engineer, and that was not built for me. So I decided I wanted to be a history teacher. Part of that was, growing up in history classes where I never really enjoyed it, and I always felt like we were just learning rote memorization of details and facts to regurgitate them on a test, and that probably played out to some of my future beliefs about what education should look like. But I thought that I could do that a little bit differently, and so became a history major, secondary ed focus. Originally thought I'd be a high school teacher, but ended up at the middle school level, and really, really enjoyed ending up where, I never thought I would, which was in a classroom in front of kids.
Oh my gosh. And then, from that, maybe some of those feelings of not even knowing that you wanted to be an educator to then going on the full opposite side of the spectrum to kind of finishing out your career in the education space as a superintendent. So walk us through a little bit of what that journey was like. And your role as a superintendent and principal along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I was probably like many educators, especially folks that get into leadership. I kind of always had that bug and felt that I wanted to lead in some capacity. But early in my teaching career, I didn't really know what that looked like. After a few years of teaching, I pursued a master's degree in ed leadership. Knowing that could parlay into something down the road, but again, didn't know where that would go. And then eventually became the assistant principal at the middle school where I was teaching, which was its own, beautiful but uniquely challenging experience. Anytime you go from peer to supervisor with a group of people, you've got to walk a line kind of delicately just to navigate that well. But that was where my administrative career started. I then had the opportunity to become an elementary school principal, which I did for 9 years in 2 different schools, and loved every minute of that. That was, if you ask me my favorite job in the field, it was that elementary school principal. There's a combination of, at the time I was a young man, the kids are young and they're still eager and they're excited. Elementary school teachers have a work ethic like none other. If you really know what an elementary school teacher's day looks like, you have profound respect for how time and people are managed throughout the course of the day, and unexpected situations as well. But then, at that point, we were in the Chicago suburbs, which is where I grew up and where my wife and I raised our sons when they were young. Moved to Vermont about 11 years ago. And when we were making that move, I decided that checking out a superintendency could be, an interesting step to take. And so it was in the course of a cross-country move that I also made the leap from building-based administrator to school district administrator, and was able to serve in a superintendent role for 8 years in the state of Vermont, and really was able to do some fun, exciting things and just leverage skills and experiences that I'd had as a classroom teacher and as a school principal, was able to utilize those to help other people, do their work really, really well. Ultimately, if you think about a superintendent, obviously superintendents navigate boards in ways that are much different than principals or teachers, but really the work is setting the table for other people to be successful, whether that's a board or whether that's someone in a classroom in front of kids. It's trying to create the conditions that people can thrive in. So I enjoyed that, and I continue to enjoy that.
What an incredible perspective, I think, too, because, sometimes superintendents, they kind of come in with this kind of inflated sort of hierarchical, like every single district is different, every single leader is different. As you were a superintendent, you were actually named a superintendent of the year, which is probably attested to your leadership style and the way that you kind of cultivated that culture within the district. But what were some of those key accomplishments or initiatives or strategies that you employed with your team at the building level, within the classroom level, that really kind of led to the success of the district overall?
Awesome question. Yeah, the honor of Superintendent of the Year was an honor unlike any I've ever had because it came from my peers. Anytime your peers recognize you for your work, that means something. I still have a plaque right over there, commemorating that I don't forget about the people that supported me with that. My superintendency the range was from 2014 to 2022. So in the midst of that, we had this big thing called the pandemic that also landed, right? And so when you asked the question about accomplishments with the team, I knew that building a team is the most important thing. I knew that identifying and nurturing and supporting leaders is fun for me. I enjoy kind of seeing where there's potential and coaching and mentoring people along in that process. And I also enjoy creating what I believe all good leaders should do is creating systems that work when they're not able to be there. If you have to have your hands on it to keep it alive, there's kind of a problem in the way it was constructed. So for me, that was always a motivating factor. And seeing how my team performed in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we all had very common experiences across the country and the world in that time, and schools had their own unique set of experiences around that. But watching that group go from initial crisis to problem solving to independent decision making, but always looking with a group kind of system-based mindset. And how are we doing this? But then how am I going to go back to my school and do this? Watching people execute on all those things that we were always trying to build and always trying to develop, it was really gratifying to see that play out. And that was a really, for as rough as the pandemic was for all of us, there were some really cool silver linings that I think came from that. Even thinking about decisions that the group made about whether school would be open or whether it would be remote for periods of time. We had some of those decisions in our laps, and we needed to make recommendations to our board, and I wanted our team to do that. And when they came to me with strong beliefs and they defended their beliefs and they said, this is what we want to do and this is why, I was able to say, hey, board, here's the deal. Here's what the group thinks should happen. And those things happen. And that was really, really cool and enjoyable to watch play out.
Give everyone a voice in those big decisions that are affecting everyone, right? The trickle-down effect. So
yeah, no question.
Absolutely. Well, you're not currently a sitting superintendent. So what are you doing now? And what have you transitioned to?
Yeah, so I'm working as a consultant in the education space. I took an interesting circuitous route to get there. I've noticed in my career that I kind of have these, you hear the saying 7-year itch. For me, there's kind of this 8 to 10 year itch that strikes. And what that has tended to look like with me is, I get into a situation, I build something and build a team, which I love. And then once that thing is sort of operating and kind of, I almost feel like maybe I've maximized my value to the team, my heart starts kind of looking elsewhere, okay, what's the next thing that I can leverage as a personal leader to kind of stretch myself and build myself and build something else. And I'm hoping that doesn't come across as a strange perspective, but that's honestly how I would describe it. So, at about that 7-8 year point of my superintendent career, I was just feeling like I needed to make a change of some sort, whether that was a change of location in the same type of role or a change of vocation. I was open to whatever. And so I ended up being recruited to join a private sector company, which was a government contracting company based out of Washington, D.C. They were doing a lot of K-12 based work, and they wanted someone with superintendent skill sets who knew something about schools, and because they didn't have anybody on their team that knew anything about schools at all. So it was a really cool fit for me, a really, really big opportunity. And I was able to work with that organization for 3 years. I do want to interject just talking about leadership, one thing I learned a lot from that experience, but one thing I really, really learned that I want educators to know, and that's educators in the classroom and in the principal's office and in the superintendent's office. I was a little bit nervous going into that role, like, hey, how are my skills going to translate? I know this school world really, really well. I don't know the business world really, really well. What I found was, first of all, education and business speak completely different languages. Absolutely no correlation whatsoever to the languages, but the messages are the same within those languages, and the needs are the same. It's just that they speak differently. And I learned that those skills I had as an educator were completely transferable to the outside world. Sometimes in education you go, what would happen in the real world? And I can tell you what happens in the real world. They do the same type of thing, they just call it different things. And I was really, really pleased to know that. So an encouragement to any educator who's ever wondering about a change of venue or a change of approach, and I know you have gone through like something similar yourself. It translates. Your transferable skills are really, really strong. I believe a great educator can do any job because they know how to make sense out of complex situations. So that was just something I identified that I think other people can benefit from. In that work, part of my job, speaking of the transferable skills, I didn't do K-12 work very long. I ended up having to accelerate my path through the company and became the chief of staff and the COO over time, which meant I was essentially helping to run the company in its entirety, which was, again, a wonderful experience. The other side of that experience is when the contract slowed down for the company and the money started to dry up. The person who laid myself off was myself. I had to identify that my expenses needed to come off the books in order to keep the company alive. So when I went through that experience, which is its own unique deal, part of my calculus was, what do I want to do next, and how do I leverage what I've done in these kind of two different worlds to continue to help people? Because as an educator at heart, I want to keep helping people. And what that's looked like for the immediate term is I've been consulting with school districts. I am located in southern Vermont, southwest Vermont to be more specific, working with some districts near me, going in and identifying and helping them to solve problems, developing plans of action, doing strategic planning work, doing governance type work about how to organize themselves for the future. That means paying attention to the legislative work and finances and all that kind of stuff, but it's taking those skills from my former roles and just applying them to try to help other people out as a consultant. And I'm really enjoying doing that for right now.
Oh my goodness. Well, as a consultant, I guess I want to tap into this a little bit more too, because you work with a variety of schools, if they're closing or they're at risk or dealing with declining enrollment, all of these sorts of like big problems and issues that are happening within those districts. So what, on the flip side, what excites you about doing this kind of work with districts, and what are you kind of still trying to figure out as you're supporting schools?
Yeah, so I think I'll give you an example of a place. I won't name any names, of course, but I'll give you an example of a place I'm working with right now. They've got some real challenges that they need to sort out, and they touch on the things you just identified. Enrollment's going down. When enrollments go down, the ability to provide services and resources to kids go down, and you start to you're trying to become all things to all people, but you don't have enough things for the people. And that's a really tough place to be. And so what that looks like is places have to make really difficult decisions about how to reorient themselves for the future. And that's what's fun to me. When I go into districts like that, and when you talk to people and spend time doing what we're doing right now, just a conversation, what you find is people are passionate. People love their schools. They care about their kids. They want to make sure that what they remember of school that was good still exists, and that opportunity is there for every student to access what they need to go become whatever it is they want to become. That's, if we want to talk about equity, that's kind of a simple definition in my mind. Like, you make sure kids get what they need to become what they want to become, period. And when you see people get excited about that, there's something to build on there. You know what I mean? Even though the money stinks and even though the numbers stink, like, you can build on excitement and you can create good opportunities. You just have to create strong foundations. You got to have really solid instruction. You've got to have really good policies and systems about how things are going to operate. You got to have great leadership, and you have to have stable leadership. Looking at schools through that lens of like what goes into just making something good, that's fun. That's really exciting for me, and it's out there. It's in every community. It's in every town. Sometimes that excitement gets tampered down by the circumstances, but you just have to be able to kind of peel back the layers and find find the joy and rebuild is what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, they have that solid foundation of, wanting to do right by kids, provide for kids, and then it's all of the little intricacies of things that happen that can, maybe cloud that vision and that passion for why we all really go into education in the first place.
And let's be honest, that happens in life too, right? We can all get beaten down by circumstances that are out of our control, but sometimes you just have to peel it back to what is in my control and who am I and what do I care about and what's important and what was I made to do, and work from there. And that's what makes life enjoyable and exciting.
Absolutely. I hate to be like a damper on the positivity too, but there is some recent legislation that has come out that has a lot of people fearful about the future of education and learning. And, in our original conversation, our first conversation, we had talked a little bit about, the understanding of education at the deep level and, how can we actually iterate and move things forward together, or even just words that mean different things in different contexts. One of the examples we talked about was proficiency-based learning. Like, okay, you go to one school and it looks this specific way. You go to another school, it looks another way. You go across the country and it looks like something completely different. So, in this time of unrest, I guess, when it comes to, educational policy and procedures and things that are being prioritized in schools, from a leadership perspective, what would you recommend for superintendents, principals, teachers as they're kind of riding these waves and navigating these challenges within their districts?
Yeah, boy, that's a $1 billion question, right?
Oh my gosh.
How much time do we have?
I know, right?
So, wow, where to begin? I think let's speak first at a federal policy level, right? And so as a teacher, I'm a former social studies teacher. So this is what I taught, and it was what I enjoyed trying to help kids appreciate. When you see what's happening federally now, and I'm not a federal policy expert, but when you see what's happening federally now, you're seeing rash, quick decisions that are being made outside of the legislative context and without the benefit of like the debate that goes into creating good policy. So one piece of advice I would give to any leader or anyone in education in general is don't react too quickly. And I'm not by any means saying like we should shirk the law or that we should, ignore our responsibilities. But I'll give you an example. I heard it just yesterday. Someone was telling me about folks in a school where they work who are making decisions like, I'm going to leave the field, I'm looking for another job. I'm, like making big decisions like that, and making those big decisions just based on the current feeling, not on like actual facts that are playing out. Because right now there's still a lot of what if. What does this Department of Education stuff really mean? What's that actually going to look like when things get farmed out to different places? So one thought that I would have if still in the seat would be like, just slow down, because other people are looking to you to see how you react. And if you freak out, they're going to freak out. And it's really important. It's kind of a parent rule, right? Like even when the kid's about to cry, don't make a big deal about it, and they might not cry. You want to kind of follow that same approach. When you're talking about actual policy development, one thing that I've learned is, people get elected to government positions, or they get elected to elected official positions because they tend to have a desire to do good and to do the right thing. I do believe that. People have different definitions of that, of what they think good and the right thing is, but they do have a desire to do their version of the right thing. But it doesn't mean they know everything. And it doesn't mean they know everything about everything. But we all are experts in something. Folks like you and I, we know the field of education. And one thing I've learned is when you have the opportunity, for example, go testify in front of legislators and tell a story about something to inform their thinking, give them what they need to make good decisions. Don't let them just operate in a vacuum where nobody is providing information to them. I don't know if people realize it, but you can even, if your state legislature is up to something and they're working on something, you can even communicate with that body. You can communicate with a House Education Committee, as an example, and say, hey, I see you're talking about this. I have some experience in this. I would be willing to testify if you'd like me. Like average Joe citizen could do that. You don't have to be a big dog to be able to create that. Now, are they going to invite you? You don't really know if they will, but you can at least try and at least get on the record of I had something to offer and something to say about this. And legislators need to be well-informed so that they can create well-informed policy that then, schools are responsible for implementing. So I guess I would say there, don't count yourself out of the process. A voice can be heard, and you don't have to be a big entity to have your voice heard. So I think a combination of don't move too quickly. Slow down, pause, like let things play out a little bit, and make sure your voice is heard in an impactful way. I think both those things are helpful for leaders to be thinking about.
Love it. Don't move too quickly. I think, that's maybe a little bit of like the history teacher in you as well, of like, being able to utilize things from the past to know, okay, well, we don't know right now, like how fast things are going to be moving. We should be more strategic. We can be thoughtful in our district about, the climate of things that are happening. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk more about your insights on educational policy. You've talked to policymakers, bureaucrats, and oftentimes these people haven't actually been in the classroom or in the schools, or if they have, it was maybe decades ago. So their experience may be a little outdated. But what's something that these people often don't understand about education at that deeper level? And what's really key for us to be effectively communicating with them?
Yeah, Jessica, the last statement you just made is actually kind of interesting, right? We all have been in school, or I would suspect we've all been in school. And with that, we have expectations on what school looks like. And, we have this human tendency to still apply what school looked like when we experienced it to what it should look like for everyone else and what it might look like now. And I think that's maybe good in some aspects, but it's really problematic in other aspects because it just, doesn't allow for growth and progress and change to happen. So I think what's really important when you're talking to policymakers is first to recognize that, I believe that policymakers in general are well-intentioned people who, pursued and achieved their roles for a purpose. Now, we could have a whole separate conversation about sometimes people lose sight of that and, their areas of interest change. But if people are wanting to do good, they've got their own perspective on what good looks like, but what they don't always have is good information. And, when you're in a position where you are especially working in school leadership, whether you're serving as a teacher leader, a school principal, a school superintendent, whatever that role may be, you got these avenues where you can actually get in front of policymakers and you can share real data with them and talk to them about what things actually look like where feet are touching the ground. And I found personally that has always been a really valuable experience. Like I've always left those scenarios where I've been able to testify in front of legislative committees. I've always left those feeling encouraged and positive because I felt heard. And it's really cool to see, your thoughts and perspective maybe influence what happens with legislation, at least the legislative process. But I think it's important for us to not assume or be despairing that we don't necessarily have a voice in the process because we do. And in today's world, again, separate podcast, but there's so much going on politically around schools that we could talk about. And it's really easy to just be like, the sky is falling. What do we do? Let's just cover our heads and hope that we don't get hit by anything. But in reality, this is the time that we actually need to use our voices more than ever before and kind of speak truth. It doesn't matter what a person's political beliefs are. Speak truth and speak truth about what's going on in classrooms and what kids need. And I believe that will always win the day.
I love that too, because I think it is, in the system of education, because it is truly that, which is a system, and there's a structure. And there's roles that play at different points and pieces that are all kind of working together, or you hope that they're working together, I should say.
Yeah. Designed to work together, right?
Yeah. So how do we kind of navigate that and not necessarily give like time and effort to whoever's the loudest, but really that we can kind of come together to move everyone forward in the same direction based off of that data or those insights that we have, as you mentioned, like people in the classrooms that are working with kids and students as we're making these policies and updating legislature to reflect the kind of new things that we have going on in education, which we're going to get to here in just a second. So I don't want to jump ahead too far, but if you could give one piece of advice to state policymakers or to those that are wanting to get involved, what would that be?
To state policymakers, I think my advice would be what feels like a well-intentioned rule or expectation or law when it comes to the trickle down game can be massive. I can't tell you. And again, I'm sitting in the state of Vermont, so that's where my experience with legislators has been. And, many times we've gone into the year where at the start of the legislative session, we've pleaded and said, listen, nothing big this year. Can you just give us time to implement all the things that you've established that we need to implement? Let us do this well and with integrity. And, the season always starts with absolutely, we're not going to throw anything big at you. And then, over the course of time, they just keep coming, and there's more and more, and your eye gets taken off the other projects that you needed to be focused on because there's a new project that needs to be focused on. So I would say if legislators can keep sight of the fact that running schools and school systems is inherently complex, and people who run schools tend to be rule followers. So when you make a rule, we tend to want to make sure that we deliver on what that's supposed to be, even if we disagree with it. People tend to want to follow the rules. And so when those rules just continue to pile up and sometimes contradict each other, it's really difficult and challenging to make things happen. So just awareness of the trickle-down effect would be the biggest advice I'd have.
Yeah. And then even thinking about implementation and how each district or each school even implements things differently. So you may be using the same words, you may be following the same sort of guidelines or procedures, but it also looks very different. And the process for implementation also looks very different. So
Absolutely.
I know one of the examples that you gave was proficiency-based learning in Vermont. And so can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit more? What were some of those key lessons that you've seen that we can maybe apply to future sort of applications?
Yeah, I think proficiency-based learning is at least our experience in Vermont with it is a classic example of how those dynamics can be challenging. So first, in the state of Vermont, 2014 or 2015, a law came into effect. It was called Act 77. It established a number of really sound educational policy. The concept of flexible pathways to graduation for students. That there's no specific track a student needs to follow. That they can kind of get their credits and proficiencies in unique and different ways in order to get to that graduation target. Requiring of proficiency-based learning as the foundational system. And with that, if a listener is not tuned into that, let's just describe that as, well, that's really hard to do, actually.
We take this on in the middle of
let's describe proficiency-based learning as a system wherein students have a really, really clear understanding of what learning they are expected to learn and be able to demonstrate in order to progress through the curriculum. And teachers are able to very clearly articulate for students what's expected and are able to easily and clearly assess, how they've done in that progress. And then the third group, parents, have a clear understanding of what that needs to look like and shouldn't have any questions about where their child may be on any specific subject or proficiency. What I just described is the ideal version of that, And in Vermont, what they did is the classic, we're going to let every district decide how to roll this out on their own. It's a well-intentioned independence. The state of Vermont has a motto, freedom and unity. And that's a cool motto, except when the freedom and the unity conflict with each other, right? When there's so much freedom that there's not any unity, or when there's so much unity that there's not any freedom, that's where you get in trouble. And Act 77, which established proficiency-based learning in Vermont, was one of those where they gave just all the power locally and really not any strong direction from the state. There was support from the state, but there wasn't any strong direction. And so what you then have is early adopters who say, okay, let's get on this. Let's figure this out. Let's put it into place. Let's take our lumps. And there are lumps to be taken. And then you have people that say, we're going to wait until the last possible minute to do this because this is going to be big and we don't want to fight the fight. And over the course of that broad implementation timeline, you get 50 different versions of something implemented. And what we're seeing now, nearly a decade later, is some places I've seen personally have abandoned the concept altogether. Some places you have students that think it's silly. You have teachers that have learned how to, by necessity for survival, game the algorithm of how to, work their scores so that, the proficiency system feels like the old ABCD type of system. And you have parents who are just upset. This doesn't make any sense to me. Did my kid get an A or did they get a B? What did they get? And by the way, they're going to college and nobody explained to me do the colleges know anything about this? And the answer is yes, of course they do. And they are actually really supportive of that work. But when schools don't do a good job of explaining how that all works, either due to lack of capacity or lack of preparation or whatever, it's a real problem. So classic example, I think, of where at the state level could have had a lot more direction from above. Here's what it looks like. Here's what you need to do. Here's when you need to do it, etc. Let people fall in line and follow the rules. Then if it's broken, you're fixing a single system as opposed to fixing 50 different systems that need to be tweaked all across the state.
Yeah, I love the way that you frame that too, of the guidance, right? So it's not just we're gonna assign, because we're rule followers, right? You got to do your homework, got to put this into place. We're not just assigning this sort of vision for the future. We're actually going to guide you to success, which is kind of the whole part of education and learning, which is
Precisely.
we have this common goal, we have this common target, and we're going to move there together with supports along the way. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah. And, looking ahead, education truly is at a turning point. We've seen the challenges of implementing large scale reform like proficiency-based learning, as you mentioned, but we're also seeing new opportunities emerge through technology. So personalized learning, competency-based education, AI-driven tools that are all kind of reshaping how students learn and how educators actually work to support students in achieving those common goals and visions. What's next, in your opinion, for education? How can we take these lessons that we've learned from past implementation and use them to build something that's stronger for our future?
We got to figure AI out. That's one thing we got to do. Or maybe, Jessica, maybe we have to acknowledge is anyone viewing this on video? Will this be video and audio version or just video?
Video, yeah. Video.
All right. So anybody on video is going to notice I have a different shirt on than I had, 10 minutes ago in the podcast, as you do too. We had a power outage that got in our way. So in between our last conversation and now, the Secretary of Education, I don't know the head of the U.S. Ed referred to AI as A1 and talked about how A1 needs to be in every school, which I saw the sauce company had like a really good rebuttal to that. It was fantastic. We need to figure that stuff out, right? And I think coming to the conclusion that AI is not going anywhere at all. AI has already touched so many aspects of our lives that many people aren't even aware of how significant of an impact it has. So as an educational system, nationwide, coming to terms with what that is and how to leverage that to advantageous ends is really the key. We can't be afraid of the technology. We have to harness the technology. And I will say the technology needs to be harnessed. I had an experience a couple of weeks ago where I was just playing around with a project and I wanted AI, in particular it was ChatGPT, to do something for me. And I asked it to come up with a long list of something, which it did very, very well. And then when I asked it to translate that list to lots of actionable items from the list, it exploded. And exploded in a bad way. Like it was like a teenager that didn't want to do any work and had to be monitored continually and redirected because it just wouldn't follow through with what it needed to do. So keeping in mind that we're still in charge of that is also kind of an important part of the process there. Let me just ask, does that take you anywhere in terms of continuing that particular question? Because it's a cool question, but I don't want to dwell on that one topic too much.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely top of mind for us, as dailies, innovators in education, personalization of learning. Like we're seeing lots of opportunities for utilizing technology in really meaningful ways. But I love that component that you mentioned of like, we still have to have human oversight. Like we cannot just trust that AI is going to teach our children and manage all of these things in our life and in our classrooms just because the technology is there. Like harnessing the technology, utilizing it, and it enables humans to do better and be better. But there is that human component that is critical in order for anything to really be of value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I also do think, Jessica, there will be many ways that AI can replace simple tasks for us. And when I say simple, I don't want to minimize any of those tasks, but there are things that can be made less complex by having a computer be able to do it 24 hours a day, as opposed to, an adult or a human able to do it during the 8 hours a day that they are on the clock, so to speak. So just making sure that we are thinking about and monitoring those lines as that emerges, taking care of people in the process, because people do matter more than computers. But I think it's possible to coexist, so to speak.
Exactly. Coexist with the human oversight. But
no question.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about AI, but is there anything else that you're seeing as maybe emerging or something else that we need to embrace when it comes to education or the way that we're moving?
I think the kind of some of the common historical themes of fiscal challenges are always going to be there. They're made even more significant now as places are seeing, funding disappearing in various capacities depending on what your needs are. So as educators and as educational leaders, got to always be attentive to how to get the most out of the least, when it comes to financial availability. I think we have continued challenges with folks that are coming into the education profession in general, I do think that the dynamic of that has changed. When I was an undergraduate and studying to be a history teacher at the time, if you told somebody you're studying to be a teacher, they'd say, "Oh, that's cool." And now if you tell somebody you're studying to be a teacher, they'll say, wow, really? You're doing that? The tone has shifted. And what I like about that is the kids that are coming into the systems now, and I probably shouldn't refer to them as kids because they are adults, but the young people that are coming into the systems as educators are there because they want to be there and they're determined and they've got a drive to have an impact, but there are less of them and there are less of them collectively. And so what that means for us from a how do we keep this entire thing running is really, really challenging and complex. A tangible example I would give you, as a superintendent, when I started in that role, if we had a posting for a teacher position, it wouldn't be uncommon to see easily double digits, sometimes approaching like 75 to 100 applicants for a role. Toward the end of my superintendency in 2022, same scenario, posting for a teaching position, you'd be lucky to see more than a handful of applicants. And that was just applicants, let alone whether they were really qualified and whether you wanted to have them in for an interview. Other things could be factors. This thing called COVID happened in the midst of that. There was a lot going on, but didn't change the fact that the numbers just seem to be changing kind of before our eyes.
Yeah, really interesting too. I think, I've connected with quite a few people at like the university level, higher ed, and we're talking about teacher preparation programs and how, if you're starting your undergrad right now in 4 years, is the things that you're learning in your undergrad still going to be relevant in the classroom setting?
Yeah.
So technology is moving at such a quick pace that if you're not kind of embracing it or harnessing it, it should come back to your word there. We're going to see incredibly more challenging teaching environments. It's not going to get easier until we're able to kind of see the systematic sort of restructuring. And that starts all the way at, that very first teaching class you have and all the way through until you get your first classroom and 10, 15 years down the line when we're able to start seeing some of that data and impact too. So
yeah, but to add to that, Jessica, let's imagine you have that student who through their undergrad career is evolving with the technology and ready to go at like a really high performing rate for a brand new teacher. But then they enter a school where change is the last thing anybody wants to undertake for, a million different reasons. Some of that might be systemic. It might be personality. It might be the principal's been there for 40 years and no, don't bring this to me. But we can also stifle that progress that needs to happen because our systems aren't ready to handle it. So again, for school leaders, there's a part where I would say you've almost got to trust these newer teachers coming in, that they've got to read on things that you may not understand. And that's hard. That's hard for a school principal to do, to just say, okay, like you try what you want to try and I'm going to believe you because kids learning and their lives are at stake. But we have to do that. If we're going to see the profession progress, we got to allow for kind of new experimentation and new actions to happen in classrooms.
Yes. I love that you kind of tied it all together there too, because it isn't just like this isolated system for the teacher or the educator that's in, but it really is this full system that also includes higher ed, which is going to start us back again at the beginning of this cycle of this teacher that's in the classroom. With dailies, we talk a lot about feedback loops and how things get stuck. Like we have the data, we have the information, but things just get stuck in these cycles of 6 weeks, 9 weeks, 3 months, 1 year. And then you're not able to iterate and move quick enough to keep up with the pace of student learning or the academic needs or whatever support you're trying to provide. And so that's where we've been stifled, is we're not able to move quick enough to keep up with what's happening. And then that kind of ripple effect where things get harder to move or less malleable over time to be able to.
No question. Because also during that same time, patterns of behavior happen as well. Jessica, I'm going to guess your experience as a teacher and probably as a student, it was the old traditional, and it still exists, the traditional conferences in the fall and conferences again in the spring. And that was when we're going to talk to the parents about what's going on with the student and, things are going to get fixed. Like what a dysfunctional and foolish process, right? And as a principal, I used to just try to encourage my teachers, no surprises, right? Like there shouldn't be anything you tell a parent at a parent-teacher conference that they haven't already heard from you in some capacity. I don't care if that's a cup of coffee or a phone call or an email, but like you need to have a relationship and we need to communicate. And to your point with what your company is doing with feedback loops and systems, you want to make sure those are full of information all the time. You don't want to drown parents with so much that they stop paying attention, but when they're starving for information, I think we all know when there's a lack of information, people make assumptions.
Very true.
If they make good assumptions, that's great. But if they're making bad assumptions, it's not cool. And there's a lot of challenge to work through. So it's a great thing you're focusing on.
Yeah. And a lot of missed opportunity along the way, like the child's like learning effort and, general perceptions and attitudes towards learning. If something isn't clicking, but their class has moved on. But if we knew about it 3 weeks ago, like that wouldn't even be a struggling point.
Precisely.
So, thinking long-term trajectory and feelings of learning and all of the things that we're kind of trying to still be human in education while leveraging technology to help us get there quicker or meet those needs that we haven't been able to at scale as easily. So,
Good stuff.
yeah, well, I mean, based on what we've learned, what's the best way for schools and districts to move forward with reform efforts or build a little bit more malleability into their systems?
It's a huge question.
I know, I'm so sorry.
No, because it comes down to people and people's temperament and their personality and their willingness to embrace or reject change, right? And so in order to be malleable, something has to be able to be physically change the shape of it, and I would say that's one of the more significant challenges that we have in schools is that openness to change. But that's where focus needs to come in. So I think, again, going back to some things we've discussed previously, being open to new ideas that maybe come from younger educators, thinking about when change comes from above, and above could be the school district or it could be the state, could be the U.S. Department of Education. When change comes from above, making sure that there are appropriate guardrails provided so that it's not a free-for-all in terms of how change gets implemented. And then supporting people through those processes is really the key. Anytime you say, yeah, we got to do this because so-and-so said so, you're likely to get a lackluster effort, but if you attend to the people that are implementing the change and having to deliver on it and experience the change on a day-to-day basis, if you attend to those folks and try to take care of them and try to help them solve their problems, you'll see people who are more connected and more engaged with the process, and the likelihood of whatever the future looks like, the likelihood of it sticking and being positive and being human-centered is much higher than if you just leave everybody to their own devices. So I think it's a combination of all those that's really the path forward for us in terms of what's down the road.
Yes. Well, I mean, we've had an incredible conversation over 2 different sessions. As you mentioned, we lost power midway through.
Did I break the third wall on that? I might have broken huge podcast rule with you there.
I'm not sure. I'm a teacher. I don't know.
I think it's good stuff. We got to let them see how things happen behind the scenes. That's worth
That's
the.
Right. We're all human. We're human.
That's true.
But yeah, I love it. Any other final thoughts for school leaders, teachers, or parents that might be listening in today based on our conversation?
I think the world is a more unique and challenging place every day. It appears every day I open up the news apps that I look at, and I just wonder what I'm going to read. And I think the best thing that we can do as parents and educators and leaders is stay the course and take care of people. If your focus is on doing the right things for the right reasons and taking care of people in the process. And what's the ultimate point of education? It's not for me to feel good as a teacher or a principal about my job. It's to make sure that those student eyes that are looking back at me are progressing from where they started when they came to me, that they're in a better educational place when they leave me. And so as long as we kind of stick to those realities, I think everything turns out okay. I do think we need to be open to the fact that the systems may change in ways that are possibly unrecognizable to us right now. But again, being ready to embrace and make sense of those things is probably our most important obligation when it comes to that. Don't be afraid, but just sort it out, figure out what the details are, and then make the good things happen. So that would be the advice I'd offer.
And yes, I think, just to kind of summarize that too, we're all in this together. There's so many educators that are navigating this alongside you, leaning into your community, leaning into those within your building, in your community at large, other superintendents in other states, principals, teachers, like we are all on this journey towards this kind of transformation that's happening, and we're all experiencing it at the same time.
Yeah.
Also in very different ways, but there's a lot of value in just connecting with others and having conversations about things that are working, things are not working, challenges, successes, in order to kind of level the playing field and also just learn from each other. Like, no, we don't have a clear vision for what, education will look like 5 years, 10 years down the line right now. So really being able to lean into those relationships to kind of help us get through it, but also like help us navigate more strategically and smarter for those kids.
Yeah, and part of that, Jessica, is resources like this as well, right? Like these did not exist when I was a teacher. The ability to tap into what somebody in a different state or country was thinking about the same issues I was facing. But now we have the ability to go online and actually see what other people's thoughts and languages around the same challenges we're all facing. And that's a positive thing. So kudos to you for putting together a program like this to do that.
Well, thank you so much for the shout out. But Dave, truly, I thank you for your time and the insights that you've shared with us over the period of the last couple conversations. The experience in Vermont that you referenced with proficiency-based learning, highlights the critical lessons really about the complexities of education reform, how everything is kind of interconnected, but also a little fragmented at times. So really focusing on the need for clear communication, strong educator support, and realistic, I think, implementation is the word there. As we look ahead, it's clear that the future for education will continue to evolve towards more personalized, competency-driven models as we see this insurgence of technology that allows us to do that easily or more easily at scale to serve all students. But the challenge will be ensuring that these innovations are designed with the right structures in place to truly support the students and educators. So we're really appreciative of your time and insights on all of those kind of pieces that we've talked about. And we're excited to see how these lessons help shape the next kind of wave and revolution in education that we're experiencing right now. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Bridging the Education Gap. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with others in your community. Join us next time as we continue to explore how educators and parents can work together to empower every child's learning journey.